So our speaker today is Jenna Lucente. She was born in Brooklyn, New York, and raised in Staten Island. She received her Bachelor of Fine Art from Syracuse University and her Master of Fine Art from CUNY Queens College, both in a concentration of painting. Please welcome me in joining a warm welcome for Jenna Lucente.
Yay, I'll just clap for myself as if it's an audience. I would like to say thank you to everyone for attending. I look forward to speaking with you today, and keeping in mind it is a coffee talk, so I hope you have your coffee. And also, because we're on Zoom, it's okay if you have coffee breath, because we can't smell your coffee breath over the computer. So your breath can be as bad as you want it to be. I'd also like to extend a warm thank you to Jean and to everyone at Abington Art Center for having me and for the opportunity to show my work there. It's always good as an artist to see the work in a different environment than like your studio or a different gallery that you might show in, and that's always nice to see. What I'm going to do is I'm going to start sharing my screen. So you'll be seeing images on the screen, and you'll also hear me talking over those images. As you heard Jean mention, the chat box is open, so people can be throwing words, comments, question in there at any time. So I'm going to start sharing my screen. So the basic outline of this talk is that, I'm going to do a little bit of behind the scenes, like imagery and talking, and I'll just be sort of flipping through a bunch of images and talking about the painting process. Then I'm going to move into the drawings that I have in the show. Of course, you can enter your questions in the chat box anytime. And Jean, please interrupt me if you need to interrupt me, if you see a question and I miss the question. And then, of course, there's more room for questions at the end. So sort of reinforcing what Jean mentioned. So just to give people a little bit of a background, a little bit of a visual, like the locusts, about once every 7 years, my studio is actually clean. So this is just a photo of one day that my studio was very clean and organized, and my paints look very nice. And that's an important thing to just remember, is that as an artist, you sort of make a mess. I wanted to give people a little bit of a look inside the studio, because for every painting and every drawing that you see, I probably have about 20 iterations of it with slight variations, different colors, different organizations, and I pin them all up on the wall and I study them for a while before I figure out like what's going to become the actual painting. So there's a lot of planning that goes on before anything even happens. Again, just like a little bit of a close-up, you could see that there are some variations with the figure and with the botanicals. And just within the process, I'm just always sort of exploring those different variations. That's part of how I work. I think every artist works differently. If you paint from plein air, you're literally painting outside what you see that day, versus someone like me, I'm in the studio planning a lot. So it's a different kind of process. So again, just like, one of those little drawings, they're small, they're easy, they're quick, they're fast. I usually use colored pencil just to get a feel for the color. What this became was a painting. It is not in the show, but it is one of my paintings. And just a little bit more inside the studio stuff, because I usually am working on a couple things at the same time. I might have like 2 paintings going at the same time. I'll also be working on sketches and working on drawings at the same time. People who work with oil paint may know that you got to work around your drying times. So, sometimes you can't work on something because you're waiting for the paint to dry, literally. Here's a photo just of me at the easel. And as big as these paintings are, sometimes you need to use a small brush. And I think sometimes you have to find that balance. So people might notice a couple things in this photo. You might notice that I'm using a maul stick. So sometimes I have to use a maul stick to help balance my hand if I'm painting an interior section, or I'm doing a line that I need like careful balance for. And you might also notice that I'm wearing nitrile gloves. And people always ask, do you wear those gloves while you paint? Yes, I wear those gloves while I paint for many reasons. But the number one reason is safety, so that I don't have any kind of chemical seeping into my skin. Because think of it, over the years, you know, it really does add up. This was taught to me by a teacher in undergraduate, which was, you know, 700 years ago. And ever since then, I've always worn the gloves, and it also makes cleanup a lot easier because there's no paint on my hands. But the number one priority is safety, right? Especially cadmium colors are known to like be bad for the liver, and things like turpentine. You don't want to have those things in your body. And I got used to it, and it's fine. So just a little typical like kind of paint mess, mixing up some paints, and sometimes I feel like a mad scientist. I actually really enjoy that part. And when I make those little sketches, part of that process then becomes that I will print out what I think is a good one at full size, and then I will trace it, and then I will transfer that template onto the canvas. So there is a little bit of a process involved in getting the image onto the canvas. Of course, it changes as I'm working, but that's sort of getting me started to have like a template to work with. This is one of the paintings that is in the exhibit. It is in progress right now. So, well, it's not right now, but you're seeing a photo of it in progress. This was Sandy, Irene, and Katrina, and it was actually one of the first paintings in the series. And I think if you see the show, you might see that it looks a little different than some of the other ones, but it is one of the first ones in the series. So this was just in progress. As you work on your images and you finish your paintings, you want to have them documented. And I'm fortunate enough to have a professional photographer within my studio building, Carson Zulinger, and he always photographs my work for me. So I really owe him a lot because of his professional photography, I'm able to apply for opportunities. And then, you know, this is the painting that's in the exhibit. And it's called Sandy, Irene, and Katrina. And people may recognize that name or those names from the floods that were in New York and in Louisiana. And I think when you think about those names, it's like, oh, those are nice names. Sandy's such a nice name. Katrina's such a nice name. Oh, Irene, that's so endearing. Except that it really isn't when it becomes a situation. And then if you think about the artist statement, we have sort of these fragile, you know, young figures kind of stuck in the flood, kind of like holding on to each other for support. You know, and something has gone wrong in some way. You know, they shouldn't be on their own. They shouldn't be in the water. You know, and I'm trying to create the mood and the atmosphere with the colors that I'm using. This was an extraordinarily muted palette purposefully to create a certain environment.
I do have a question in the chat, Jenna, from
Yes, great.
She's asking, why is it named in that order of the hurricanes, Sandy, Irene, Katrina?
I would like to admit that it just sounded good to me, so I just named it in that order. I could have done my research a little bit more because I believe that it is actually the opposite of the order, you know, chronologically. It would be Katrina, Irene, and then Sandy in terms of the chronicle, you know, order of it. So sometimes as an artist, you kind of make those kind of decisions, you know. You're true to the facts, or sometimes you mix things around just because it might sound better. Did that answer your question?
Let's see. Yes.
And we do have the artist statement up here. So, you know, and it's on my website. I would encourage people if they want to read more about it. And some of you saw it as you were waiting to come into the meeting. So we have some sketches here, and these sketches, again, go back to some of the paintings that were in the exhibit. This is a sketch for Tidal Bike. I think what's always interesting to people is to see like the sketch that didn't make it. So this is, you know, one of the versions that I was playing around with that didn't quite make it into the final round, so to speak. Playing around with some lilies. People may not realize also that in order to achieve like the exact color I'm looking for, I often have to mix very, very custom colors. So people might not think that you would add yellow into blue without it turning green, but you can, you know, so that you have like a warmer blue. And things like this are like very important to me while I'm painting, that the color is like exactly the right tone. And someone once asked me, well, how do you know like it's the right tone? How do you know that it's correct? And I think it's sort of like food. Like, how do you know when food needs a little salt or might need a little pepper, or something like that? You sort of have to tune into it a little bit and kind of listen to what it's asking for. So very often my colors are like very custom mixed. And that's one of the things I love about the oil paints is I feel like I can really achieve exactly the colors I'm looking for. This is, of course, that painting in progress. So I think a lot of times people like to see that in progress part. You could also see some other paintings in the background. Usually I tint the background, then I trace the template, then I might kind of outline it, and then I might go into it with paint. So you can see here, you know, this is me kind of mixing up the colors and applying those colors onto the canvas. And of course, we have the finished work. Back to that professional photography, one of the things that's really good about it is it's fairly accurate for color. If you look at my, you know, snapshot, it's not quite accurate for color, whereas this is much more accurate for color. This is in the exhibit. And of course, you know, we have that kind of storybook situation where someone might look quickly and say, oh, a girl on a bike, that's so nice. Except it's actually not that nice because she's by herself, she's in the water, bringing what should be a child's enjoyment through a flood. And we're kind of peering in on that. We're back to those sketches because it is such an integral part of how these works kind of come to be. And I use a lot of tracing paper and move around a lot of the figures on the tracing paper to figure out what works. I had these figures before I had the painting. So I literally and figuratively had these figures floating around the studio for quite some time before I figured out where they would go. And they ended up here. So this is the painting Continental Drift, which is in the exhibit. So you're seeing it kind of in progress and in the context of the studio. You could also see that I have the sketch kind of taped to the top of the painting to help guide me. And it's interesting because much as I use that sketch as a guide, sometimes things just take their own life to them, like the colors don't behave the right way, react the right way. So I just sort of make changes as I go. I really enjoyed the palette for this painting for some reason. I just really connected with the purples, the pinks, and the greens. And I think it goes back to that exact tonality that I was looking for. You know, that the pink is a little bit purpley, but it's also sort of muted, and the green is kind of purple with a little bit of black in it. So like just being really, you know, kind of cognitive of how those colors work together. I think all of them have at some point the same like base in it, like a pink base. And then I built on that. So you can have a yellow that has pink in it, or you can have a green that has pink in it. You can have a purple that has pink in it. And somehow you can like have it all be harmonious. Again, just a studio shot, a reminder that I'm usually working on like more than one thing at a time. So I think it's always good to kind of see the back and forth that we as artists might do. And thank you so much for Carson to help me shoot my work. And that's, you know, how I was able to apply for this exhibit. And this is, again, one of the paintings that's in the exhibit, Continental Drift. And people have often asked, you know, are they holding on to a a boat, a float? Like, what are they holding on to? For me, it's a rubber tire, because I don't know if people have seen a lot of the photos of like flooding that we'll see in the news. Somehow there's always tires floating around in the middle of the flood. And it just seems so wrong in every way. You know, you see people like wading through the water and there's like tires floating around. And I just thought that that would be an interesting thing, that they sort of grabbed onto this tire and they're just sort of there with each other, waiting for, you know, who knows what, to be found, to be helped, who knows. We have a question in the chat box about how do you pick the palette for each painting? And you know, some of it is instinctual, like I'm feeling very colorful today. And some of it is very methodical, which goes back to all the sketches. So for this, for example, I probably did 20 different like color versions, and then did this color version. I look at them on the wall, and then I might decide what feels right for the mood. And again, a lot of it goes back to intuition. When do I add more salt? When do I add more pepper? When does it need a little ginger, right? So I sort of have to see about how I feel in reaction to the paint and the color. But it's not an easy choice, because I think there is always a lot of possibility there. And sometimes I want the painting to feel more depressed, and sometimes I want it to feel a little more alive, or certain elements in the painting to feel more alive. Like here, the botanical is more alive than the figures. And that was important to me. You know, as I was looking through some of my own images, and I'm going to forward a slide, this is the painting that's in the exhibit, Helicopter Rescue. Because very often, again, you know, you see the people on the news, they're in the flood, they have to have like the US Coast Guard come in with the spotlight and rescue them. But I had forgotten that I had originally intended this painting to be very warm. So back to that palette, the original palette for this was supposed to be really, really warm. And as I was working, I was just not feeling it at all. And it ended up being super cool. And I have, you know, some other questions in the chat box, like what is the drying period for your large paintings? And the answer is anywhere from 3 days to who knows how long, because it depends on the color. Different colors have different drying properties. So it depends on the color, and then it also depends on the temperature in the studio. So for example, in the summer, you know, 2 to 4 days, I might have something dry. In the winter, it might take 7 to 9 days for certain areas to dry. And then of course, there's a difference between when a painting is dry to the touch versus, oh, what's dry is the skin of the paint, underneath is still drying. So, you know, for a lot of oil paintings, it could take like a couple of weeks for it to be 100% dry. But dry to the touch, it could be a few days. And that goes back to why I am working on maybe 2 at a time, so I can go back and forth. Because if I painted the whole background of this, I kind of can't touch it for a couple days. I also see another question that says, what draws you to painting on large canvases? Part of that has to do with the fact that I enjoy physically being part of the painting. Like I feel like I am part of the painting. And I also think when you look at the painting, you're actually like in the environment yourself. You're part of it. It's you know, grand. It's part of your vision. You're not studying into something. It's sort of looking at you. So I love working really large. If there were no limitations in terms of, you know, money, transportation, you know, all these storage, I would paint enormous paintings and kind of love it. I love really large paintings because again, I feel like you're in the painting. Back to sketches. So very often it might even be like a subtle detail, like, is it important to me to have the arm, you know, up on the left with the glove? Is it important to me that the hands are holding the mourning dove? So there I'm able to kind of play back and forth, and sometimes I don't know what the answer is. I see another question in the chat box. How large have I worked? So Larry, on average, you know, the size that you saw in the exhibit last night is an average size. In the past, I've done some things that have been larger. In the past, I've done some things that have been smaller. And I also have a large public artwork in Staten Island that's much larger, but that's for the public, and it is a public work. And I'll have a reference to my website at the end, so you could check that out. But thank you for asking, Larry, and thank you for coming last night, by the way. We have more sketches. So, you know, I'm always sort of playing around with what's going to happen. You know, I was sort of, so by the way, this isn't my artist statement, but this bird was supposed to be the mourning dove, which is referential of Noah's Ark. And people might remember the story of Noah's Ark, where, you know, they were looking for land and they were looking for land and looking for land, and they sent the dove out. And it was only when the dove came back with, you know, a little bit of branch in the mouth that they knew that there was land after the flood. So, you know, sometimes the story that I know in the work may not even communicate to the viewer, but I know where that story kind of came from. So, you know, again, I was sort of like thinking in that Noah's Ark kind of way, well, what would happen, you know, if this figure was sort of like looking at these pairs of animals kind of walking and going on to possibly an ark? Would that figure then join them with a ladder, or who knows? So just sort of investigating. And again, you know, comparing and contrasting before it becomes the final painting. Like, do I prefer the one on the top? Do I prefer the one on the bottom? Sometimes I'll use different color schemes. Sometimes I'll use the same color scheme. To me, this is a really important decision. To most everyone else, it's probably like whatever, but to me, it's an important decision. And it has to do with the mood, I think, that the painting sets. You know, and again, just sort of showing some of that process behind the scenes of tracing, because sometimes I'll make the drawing that I'll trace it. So this way I could have many different variations, and I can color it in with my colored pencils. And back to that enlargement process, you know, I sort of, you know, blow them up, I enlarge them, and then I draw them. And you could see here is an example where I was really trying to figure out what was going on, because I wasn't liking some of the things I was seeing. You might also notice that this is in reverse. So it was like drawn in reverse, so that when I put it to the canvas, it would be the right way. So very often I'll sort of, you know, when I print out the big one, I might print it out in reverse, work it in reverse, and then when I flip it back over, it becomes the correct way. This is what that painting became. This is actually, it might be my favorite painting of the series. I feel like the colors are just, they're like the most perfect colors for this painting. And this painting I feel very connected to because, you know, pandemic struck in the spring. I think all of us were very, you know, kind of taken aback at the new adjustments that we had to make. So being able to work in the studio and just paint, and the physical application of paint, it's very therapeutic. And I just felt like the colors just sort of told me what to do, and I just listened. And I really like the warm light on the figure. And some people have said that, you know, this painting was a little more hopeful. And I guess you could see it that way. That's a nice thought, that it's hopeful. You know, I would still go back to, you know, why is the figure by themselves in the water waiting for the mourning dove to come back? But at least the mourning dove did come back with good news. So that's something that's good. And people may also not realize that, like, depending on what colors you are combining, you'll get a different result. So, you know, not all reds are created equal, not all yellows are created equal. So sometimes I'll do like little science experiments, you know, with different colors to see like which pink am I looking for, you know. And I love being able to like do all this like little science experiment kind of testing stuff before I can find the right color pink. Just a studio shot, you could see the works in progress and some stretcher bars on the floor. And then eventually that pink test, you know, started to get realized on this canvas. And this is actually one of those paintings that I did a lot of planning for and then ended up changing it, which is always interesting. I didn't love what the figure was doing, and I had an intention of doing something else, but I ended up changing it. And sometimes it's okay to respond to that change. We have a question about Gamblin paints as opposed to other oil paints. And I will say that I am not a paid spokesperson for Gamblin, but I just personally love the viscosity of the material. It's also not a super expensive paint, nor is it a super cheap paint. So it's sort of mid-range in terms of the price, but I love the viscosity, and they also have some really great specialized colors. It's kind of like you just get married to something and then you don't want to give it up. If it's a good relationship, you want to stay in it. So Larry, I'm not cheating on Gamblin ever. You know, I'm going to stay loyal to Gamblin for my oils, and you know, kind of stay with them. They've always been good to me. So you sort of have to see what works. And you know, in that painting process, you know, sometimes you got to flip the canvas around to paint a little area or things like that. So just another studio shot. Again, this is Morning Dove 2. And you know, part of that same series, again, this was done during the pretty much the highlight of the pandemic, although I guess we could say April really was, but you know, just sort of, this painting was really a great resource for me to be able to apply the paint. I also wanted this painting to have a lighter feel to it. The content is a little bit lighter. People describe this as more hopeful even than the other one. So I was like, you know, if you see hope, we'll go with hope. You know, I think this one also has a little more activity, which is something that I usually don't have. Usually the figures are extraordinarily stagnant, and here there is more activity, and even the bird is active. So that's something that I usually don't do, but I felt like I needed it today in this painting. Also in the exhibit are a series of drawings that I did, and it is part of the same series, except that they're worked a little bit differently. And what it is it's manipulated image underneath, and then what's called mylar, which is architectural drafting film, on the top that I then draw and paint over. And you could see here that this figure is located, you know, near New Orleans, near Houston, near Jacksonville. These are, you know, that whole Gulf Coast area, which is affected by so many floods. And of course, we're all sort of familiar with, you know, the map of the United States, and that has been a great reference point for me for these drawings. Again, you know, I'm working with an image that is laid under. So at the bottom, that's what the image looks like, sort of. And then I lay the mylar on top to give it like a ghostly look. I use pencil and acrylic paint on top of it. A lot of the maps that I use are actually in the public domain. They're from the federal government, and people may or may not know this, but you can use all kinds of stuff from the federal government, whether it's a Library of Congress or the federal government. It's in the public domain. So very often they have like survey maps, they have political maps, they have geographical maps, they have flood maps, they have voting maps, they have district maps, all kinds of different things. So, you know, I usually will pull from something like that, because you do want to be a little bit careful when you're using images about copyright infringement. So I'm always making sure that, you know, the image is legal for me to use. And Larry asked a question, tell us, manipulating the map, what did you do? So I'm lucky to have a lot of technical skills at my hand, so I can grab an image from somewhere. I can put it into Illustrator, and I can manipulate the colors in Adobe Illustrator. and then print it out, manipulate it. So I literally can like dictate the color of how I want it to be. People who are familiar with Illustrator might know that there is like a live trace feature. So in Adobe Illustrator, I'll designate the live trace to have a breakdown of 6 to 8 colors, and then I'll assign 6 to 8 colors into the file to get the results that I'm looking for. So there's actually like a bunch of technology that goes on for these to be made and look the way I want them to look and be cohesive. So, you know, just studio shot, working on the mylar overlay. And sometimes I'll work on the mylar overlay first. So that's what you're seeing here. This is a piece that does end up in your exhibit at Abington. So, you know, here I was working on that orchid organization and the two girls having a conversation underneath the orchid. Keep in mind, an orchid is like extraordinarily delicate. It's also pretty small, you know, so these are important things for me to just keep in mind. And back to that technical process, you know, people who are in print may know what they're looking at, or they might know anyway, but you know, there's a Pantone color book. So sometimes I'll see what I painted. What did I paint? And then I'll use my Pantone book to find the matching colors. And then when I go to Illustrator, I'll assign the colors out based on what I painted so that I know that they'll match up. So there's, again, a lot of the behind the scenes kind of work for making that happen. So again, sometimes I work on the overlay first, and then I'll sort of marry it up, you know, into the whole one. And this was actually a really old map. I couldn't find the original for this talk, but it was like really, really old, like nothing current. But I thought it was really important to use that old map and just sort of manipulate it, because it is like the whole world. That we're seeing, you know, all of this climate change and flooding, and how much it's forgotten about. I think that's one of the things that doesn't come across as much in my work as I would like it to, is I kind of want us to recognize that a lot of times people who are in a flood zone or people who are, you know, victims of they're forgotten about. Right? And just like, how could you forget? Well, we forget as a country, you know, it's like, oh, these girls, oh, well, you know, next week we'll forget all about them. You know, maybe they're still homeless, but, you know, we're going to forget all about them and move on to the next thing. Because there's people from Louisiana or Sandy or Irene, Katrina, you know, all these things, like they still may not have a home, you know, still to this day. And the flooding is happening over and over. And very often we just forget our most vulnerable people and just forget, you know, so many of them. When I'm walking around, I usually end up taking photos. And sometimes those photos usually end up in the artwork at some point. So, you know, this is a good example of, I was walking by this plant sale of lilies, and then of course had to kind of work with those lilies. So, you know, that's how a lot of the images come to be, is me walking around or me finding things out in the world to paint. You know, in this, again, it's sort of like that reference to Puerto Rico and the flood and storm that was in Puerto Rico. And again, you know, very kind of forgotten about to this day. But we have those fragile figures. And here there is a little more activity, you know, maybe, you know, she's holding her friend for support, or maybe she's trying to help her, you know, in some way. You know, just a little bit of a studio shot. And again, you know, I'll walk around, I will take some photos of things. I'll bring those photos back to the studio and start to work with them. This is a work that's not in the exhibit, but I played around with it anyway. Just the idea, you know, back to the idea of vulnerability, that the dog would be floating around without any owner, which again sort of is similar to the young girl who has no parent with them, but that the dog is sort of like on its own in a rowboat, which makes no sense. The dog can't take itself any. but yet this is the only place the dog could have safety. And, you know, then we see it sort of in context. And to answer Rosanna and Larry's question, I have not gotten to exhibit these in a major hurricane area, which would be great. I was able to be a part of an exhibit that did focus on climate change, so that was good to contribute to that. But I haven't specifically taken these to an area where, you know, it was more relevant. So that's something to look into, you know, in the future. So, you know, for those of you who are able to see the exhibit, it's always good to see the artwork in context, in the environment of the host. So thank you to Abington Art Center. Someone commented last night that they felt that the gallery itself was a very warm environment. They had previously seen my work somewhere else where it was a little bit of a colder environment. So it was nice to hear them say that it's in a warmer environment. And I would say if you haven't seen the show and you're in the area, it's definitely worth taking a ride over there. There's also 2 other great exhibits, and it's a wonderful art center. So that's sort of my talk. And I think at this time we can take questions, or we can review things, or whatever people would like to do. Thank you for listening. And I'm sorry I said, you know, and you know, 100 times, because I think we all do that. And then we realize it when we listen back on Zoom, how many times we say those words.
I think you did great. Thank you so much, Jenna. So now would be a perfect time for questions. You can ask them in the chat, or we've got about 10 people here today. So if you just want to unmute yourself and ask your question, feel free to do so.
I have a question.
Yes, Carol.
It's not really a question. I just want to say that some of the vines that come over on the sides look like fingers, maybe menacing fingers, which I think promote the idea of the hurricane and the treacherous problems that exist because of it. I really like that. Okay, that's it.
Thank you so much. I love your comments. And I love that everyone can kind of see something a little bit different. That's something that I may not have even seen before in my own work, but I love that you saw that.
Does anybody else have any questions for Jenna, or comments maybe? I have a question, so I think I'll just steal the floor. So I've definitely noticed in your work, use a lot, like you're always using tracing paper, you have this body of work with mylar. In addition, I did take a look at your installation on your website at the Arthur Kill Station, and it's on glass. And I feel like your work really has this theme of transparencies. You use them a lot, and even your oil paintings, I get this feeling of kind of like this layering and overlap. Can you just go through like maybe how that entered into your process or what that means to you?
Yeah, it really means everything. And interestingly enough, it is kind of like the root of everything. How it originally entered, I would say, was a very organic process, which is I think wanting to replicate, let's say, a drawing. So I used tracing paper. And then as the tracing paper is floating around my desk, I'm thinking, oh, these 2 need to go on top of each other. And then these 3 need to go on top of each other. And that was quite a while ago. So ever since then, I've sort of really tried to investigate that idea of transparency and layers more. So for example, maybe the layer behind is one thing and the layer in front is another thing. You know, even in the paintings, which are solid, it is a layer of what's up close and what's further away, right? So I'm sort of using that as a layer in that way in your view. But I wish, and I will be doing more that layering. That's something I, as an artist, want to investigate more. Like, how do I utilize that layering process to help get my content across a little more cleanly and specifically?
Right. And also a little bit, maybe this is a little further out there, but something about your process does remind me of like a printmaker, because you're kind of like flipping back and forth, and something about your lines reminds me of like an intaglio or like an etching. I'm wondering if you've done any work in that medium at all.
I have not, but it has been recommended to me a number of times.
Sure.
I don't have a background in printmaking, so I would have to like learn that whole arm of things, which has been part of my hesitation because, you know, there's only so much time and energy in my day and life. So it's like to learn a whole new thing, but it's worth investigating for sure. I wish I had the skill at my disposal.
Right. Yeah. Okay. Thank you. Thank you very much.
Yeah. Mhm.
Can you hear me?
Definitely. Hello.
Hey, by the way, it was Rosanna who was asking all those questions before. So now I'm asking a question. I was thinking about the character, the little girl, and I was wondering if you used her in another place, because I'm looking at these like elements in your paintings as vocabularies.
Mhm.
And when I was thinking of other places as well, I said, oh, why don't I also ask her what other types of work, can you give us some examples of other types of work, or should we just refer to the website? So 2 questions: the character usage and like other examples of your artwork.
Yeah. So to answer your question, I have used this character in different variations over the years, which is pretty crazy to think about. I think I started to use this figure in 1998, maybe. So that's 22 years ago, believe it or not. And at that time, and I don't have this series on my website, but at that time I was doing a series of girls at a swimming pool. So they were all the young girls at a swimming pool and doing all kinds of swimming things. And that was its own series. And that series lasted for quite a few years. And then the girls sort of did some other things over the years. And then they took a little break for a while. And then they returned to me about 3 years ago. So they're sort of like, they're almost like people in my life that we, come and go. So they sort of live with me throughout the years. And then to answer Larry's question, other example, on my website, I really only have past 10 years worth of work because I feel like that's where my work is now. I don't really have the older stuff available because I just feel like it's not how I want to be represented. But it's probably out there somewhere in the internet world. But yeah, I think as an artist also you have to like pick and choose how you want to be seen. And maybe sometimes it's a good idea not to show every single thing you've ever done, right? But to just show a select series or to show a select grouping or, sort of cultivate, because even the series that was before this series, which is on the website, is more about like environment and commentary on environment. So that sort of does fit in with this series as well.
Perfect, thank you.
Yeah, thank you for asking. Any other questions? All questions are good questions.
I have one other question.
Yes.
I do also kind of see like almost like maybe an Asian or Japan influence. Like I'm thinking of like a lot of Japanese ink drawings and prints, especially with like the floral motifs. Does that enter your mind at all when you're making artwork?
Yes, absolutely. First of all, I love like the flatness of that, like how everything is so flat. And then we have the botanical motifs. So definitely that's something I look at for reference without trying to emulate it. Just sort of letting it be sort of a background voice and understanding it and sort of doing my own thing still. because you always want to do your own thing while acknowledging maybe some other art history type of elements in the scope of things.
Yeah, I feel like in your paintings, you get like a lot of space with just a little bit. You just have like kind of these two layers, and you really get that feeling of like the expanse of the water with just kind of like almost this really like shallow depth. So I really love your work, and I'm so glad you could show with us.
Yeah, I mean, thank you so much, Jean. And I'm thrilled to have the show up there. I think it's great to see the work like with itself, with a number of paintings and a number of drawings together. And just to be able to have it in that environment. Also, I haven't shown my work in that area, so I'm glad to have it up in Pennsylvania at Abington. And if you haven't seen the show, I'd encourage you to go see it, and the other two exhibits that are there as well. They're there until the first or second week of November. So you can always check the Abington Art Center website for hours and directions and all of those things. And next week, I know there's an artist talk with the other two artists who are in the series.
It's actually next month.
Next month, right?
Yes.
Like I said, next month.
So yeah, everything Jenna was saying was right, that you can come to if you don't know where Abington Art Center is, we're right on Meeting House and Jenkintown Road. We're right at that corner. Again, you can find directions on the website. We have limited hours due to the COVID situation. We're open Tuesday through Thursday, noon to 6 p.m. You can stop by anytime to see the exhibition. And the show will be up until November 14th. Last but not least, if you would like to see more talks like this online and more things produced from Abington Art Center, you can always make a donation at abingtonartcenter.org/donations. Does anybody have any final questions or parting words to Jenna before we end our talk today?
Just one final question is about what is your, I guess, favorite color in terms of the palettes that you use specifically for this series? Or what has most meaning for you?
That's a really tough question, because I think it would be like a mother picking her favorite child. You know, you're not supposed to have a favorite because they're all kind of different and unique in their own way. So I don't know that I have an answer, although I really did love the color in Continental Drift for some reason, the pinks and the purples with a little bit of green and ochre. So that's a really tough question. Hard to answer that.
Thank you.
Okay, well, thank you to everybody today. Sorry, my connection's a little unstable, so that's why I keep kind of like winking out a little bit. Thank you for everybody for showing up. And like I said, we'll have another artist talk November 14th. You can register online at abingtonartcenter.org. Thank you, everyone. Have a great weekend. Thank you, Jenna. Bye-bye.
Thank you for coming. Bye, everybody.